Nicole's going to get things started here.
Great. Yes. So good morning, and thank you so much for being with us today. In this session, we'll be sharing some research and a tool to support information literacy in first-year writing. And we have already introduced ourselves. Julia Voss could not be with us today, but the rest of us are here. Okay, so today we will briefly share some of our research and a couple of key findings to set the stage for how this research might inform classroom practice. We'll spend the bulk of our time exploring a peer review tool we are developing and give you a chance to try it out. And we'll end with a few conclusions and Q&A. We'll get started with a bit about our research. Our research goals are to examine the effect of collaboration between writing instructors and librarians on first-year students' information literacy skills. And more specifically, we're interested in exploring critical frameworks highlighted by both the National Council of Teachers of English and the Association of College and Research Libraries. And finally, we're interested in the use of document-based interviews as a way to explore critical threshold concepts in writing and information literacy. For our methodology, we recruited students from first-year writing courses that included collaboration with a librarian and focused on critical information literacy applied to popular sources. We recruited a total of 26 students, all of whom consented to contributing their final papers to the research project. Of these 26, 16 participated in semi-structured interviews that included open-ended questions, as well as questions that engaged with their final papers. And we had two phases of coding. In the first phase, two faculty members, Julia Voss and Loring, and one librarian, myself, coded essays and interview transcripts using a grounded theory approach. And in a very small nutshell, grounded theory is an approach that allows themes to emerge from the data set for theory development. In Phase 1, we open coded to identify themes around writing and student characteristics. We also used a predetermined closed coding process using the trust indicators, which are a set of characteristics describing reliable and ethical journalism. We had two investigators code each interview transcript and essay. And this is an overview of our coding categories that we'll be sharing with our findings. As I mentioned, we use the trust indicators, which were developed by an organization called the Trust Project to examine students' understanding of critical analysis of sources. The trust indicators were taught to students in the classes from which the participants were recruited, and they include author, reporter expertise, type of work, which you can also kind of think of as genre, citations and references included within the source, methods or how the article or story was created and why it was created, whether or not appropriate local sourcing was done, and whether or not the article or story included representation of diverse viewpoints. Okay, so this is an overview of our coding categories that we'll be sharing with our findings. As I mentioned, we use the trust indicators, which were developed by an organization called the Trust Project to examine students' understanding of critical analysis of sources. The trust indicators were taught to students in the classes. Wait, am I repeating this slide? No? Okay.
Yes, I think you are.
Okay, no, I know. I was supposed to move on to the second category. So our second coding category includes student characteristics that emerged from our open coding. The student characteristics we looked at included race, students identifying marginalization, students defending their own culture. And I'll dig into those a bit more later in the presentation. And then finally, for our analysis of student source use, we looked at source types and appropriate and accurate use of sources, including content, form and type, context, and author expertise. And now I'll turn it over to Julia, who will share key findings in our analysis. And we're going to start off with that last category, the student source use category.
Thank you. So first up, we will share our results from what we coded from the student essays in terms of how accurately students use these different sources. So one of these categories that we coded was how accurately the student represented the content of the source. So as you can see, they generally did a good job of representing the content. 78% did represent source content accurately. 21% from all of these sources we analyzed were not represented accurately. And so this included crediting information from another source as coming from a different source, mischaracterizing the content through their summarization of the content, and sometimes cherry picking information that was not representative of the source as a whole. We coded as not representing the content accurately. And then, believe it or not, we had 3 instances or 1% of cases in which there was not really a mention of the content. And so those are kind of outliers, but it was funny to come across those instances. Next up, for does the student represent the source accurately in terms of the source form or type or genre, whatever word you would like to use. So here you can see about 45% of the cases the student did represent the type or genre accurately. 15% they did not represent the source form or type accurately. This was not really limited to any specific types of sources. A lot of times it included when a student might have referred to a source as an article and didn't really get more specific than that, which can be problematic if they're referring to like an op-ed, for example. And then a lot of students also struggled to analyze sources that were reporting on the results of studies. So that fell into that category often. And then 41% did not mention the source form or type. And again, this was not really limited to a specific type of source. In some cases, it didn't matter as much when it really was just as simple as saying, this is an article. But in other cases, we did feel that not mentioning the source type or genre left out pretty critical information about the source, which led to inaccurate representation and analysis of the source. Next up is source context, which is the publication type or venue within which the source was published. So 44% did represent the source venue accurately. And this could include if they mention the kind of general reputation of the publication type, the sort of political leaning. In some of the courses, they were taught to use a media bias chart. And so a lot of them use that to contribute to their analysis of the publication type. Only about 6% did not represent the publication type accurately. And that could have been from just kind of a misunderstanding of the political standpoint or the editorial context of the publication. And then a large number, 49%, did not mention the publication type. And again, depending on the context of the article that they were citing, this mattered more in certain cases than in other cases. If they just mentioned the name of, say, the New York Times, and it's a reported article in the New York Times, you kind of get a sense of what kind of article it's going to be. But if they're citing a much more local or specialized publication, not mentioning the publication type, again, left out some pretty critical information that you need to understand the context of the source. And then finally, for The author we coded for whether or not the student represented the source accurately in terms of the author's expertise or relationship to the content, which could be determined from either the author's bio in the article, like at the bottom of the article on the publication, or just by kind of Googling the author to get a sense of what they do and how they're related to the topic. So only about 23% of the time did the students represent this accurately. And usually that was clear that they had read that little bio within the article. So in cases where the publication made that information clear. These are from papers that the students were assigned to write about a topic using popular sources. So 23% represented the author expertise or relationship to the content accurately. 6% did not. The examples that really stood out to us were cases where it was clear that the author had some kind of personal stake in the topic, whether they were the founder of a company that had a financial incentive in some kind of product, that kind of thing. An author who is noted for their kind of political stance in a lot of instances, and the student didn't pick up on that. And then 71% of these cases, the student did not mention the author expertise or relationship to content. And again, a lot of the times this is not really a big deal, especially if the author of the source is just a staff writer for a news publication. But again, in some cases, not mentioning this led to inaccurate analysis of the source by missing out on factors that may have contributed to how an author would portray whatever they're writing about in a different way. So I will pass it back over to Nicole to talk about some of our other findings.
Great, thanks, Julia. So from those results, we can see overall trends in student source use. Our study also looked at identity factors, which revealed patterns that highlight equity, inclusion, and students' funds of knowledge as it relates to information literacy. So I'll share a few high-level pieces of those findings. In addition to source use in the assignments, we coded interview transcripts and student papers looking at two major categories. First, we looked for evidence of student understanding of and use of the trust indicators that I mentioned earlier. We coded these as present, absent, or negative, with negative being instances where students explicitly did not appropriately apply the trust indicator. The second category we coded for was those identity and affective dimensions of student characteristics that I mentioned earlier, including students of color, students identifying marginalization, and students defending their own culture. And I'll break those student characteristics down a bit more. These are identity and affective dimension codes, which emerged from our analysis of recurring themes that came up in the interviews and essays. And they came up naturally, so we weren't necessarily asking about these things, but the students brought them up themselves. So for the first category, racial identifiers were taken from how students identified when they applied to Santa Clara University. And then for the second category, students who identified marginalization were those who raised in their essays or interviews instances of stereotyping or misrepresentation of their own culture or identity as they engaged in their research topics or the sources that they found. This identification was related variously to race, gender, and affinity. And those who did not identify marginalization did not raise issues of stereotyping and misrepresentation of a group that they are part of. And then that third column, students who defended their own culture, were students who pursued the topic or project as an opportunity to expose or challenge the way in which a group that they identified with had been misrepresented in the media or other sources. So based on these categories, we grouped these characteristics into two macro categories that we labeled minoritized and majoritized. When we combined these two coding schemes, trust indicators and the student characteristics, to analyze overall critical information literacy scores for minoritized and majoritized students. And we have results for both essays and interviews. So in this graph, we've represented the average total number of critical information literacy markers, again, based on those trust indicators, that students demonstrated in their essays with a maximum possible score of 7. From this analysis, those students in each of the three minoritized categories scored higher than the correlating majoritized category. Students identifying marginalization scored the highest at 4.57, followed by those defending their own culture at 4.33, and students of color at 3.87. In the majoritized category, students who did not identify marginalization scored 2.56, and those not defending their own culture scored 2.9. And finally, those students who identified as white averaged 3. Similarly, we coded the interview transcripts, and the scores in this graph represent the average scores for those interviews. And from this analysis, those students in each of the three minoritized categories, again, had higher average scores than the correlating majoritized categories. So our overall interpretation of this analysis is that minoritized students had better critical information literacy skills than majoritized students. And we believe this may be the result of the knowledge and experience that these students bring into the classroom, drawing on their lived experience. And we see this as a critical asset that can be brought to bear in the classroom and a way to challenge deficit thinking when conceptualizing assignments and classroom activities. We've also had some initial conversations about the sort of differential experience for minoritized students and the possible additional labor that it might create for them. So those are some of our research and high-level findings. And in the rest of the presentation, we'll engage with you in a tool that we're developing to capitalize on this. And it's a peer review tool designed for sources. And I will hand it over now to Bryce, who will get us started with that.
All right. Hello, everyone. As we said, the rest of this session is going to be dedicated to our in-development peer review tool. So quick little background, this tool was developed as building on the trust indicators that we mentioned earlier. It's also building on the data that we collected throughout the research process, as well as some input from my peer review experiences as an undergraduate student. So one thing to note, this tool is not meant to teach source literacy or information literacy. It is meant to complement in-classroom instruction and provide students with an opportunity to practice their skills in a real-world scenario where they're peer reviewing their fellow students' papers. So here's a quick background or a quick overview of what we're going to do. So first things first, I'm going to be leading a walkthrough of the tool that we did ourselves. And so this should help you get an understanding of what's going on with the tool. And then after that, we're going to let you guys go into breakout rooms, have a couple of discussions, and actually practice using one of the sources from our students. I saw the chat.
I'll go ahead and answer that in the chat, Bryce, if you want to keep going.
Okay, sounds good. So the tool is divided into 3 steps. The first one is the reviewer source analysis, where the peer reviewer, or in this case us, are going to go through the actual source featured in the student essay on the site it's located. We're not looking how the student has interpreted it yet. So we're going to read the actual source on the site or venue that it's featured. Then we're going to make note of the 4 categories that we had already discussed earlier: source content, source type, source venue, and the author's credentials. Step 2 is the peer review source analysis, where we actually go into the student's essay and pull out instances where they mentioned the source and how they analyzed it. We're also going to then interpret or analyze how they use that source using those same 4 trust indicator categories that we had already mentioned. And then finally is the post-analysis meeting and discussion, where the peer reviewer will meet with the student or author of the paper to discuss the similarities and differences between steps 1 and 2, as well as note strengths and areas for improvement in the student's paper. It's very important that we have strengths and areas for improvement, because we don't want to discourage students from continuing to write by just highlighting areas where they can improve. We also don't want to just give them areas where they're strong, because that doesn't really give them room to grow. So very quickly, the source that we are using for this example is linked up top. If you guys can click on that, take a few minutes to read through it. Will also post the link in the chat, and then we'll reconvene in about 4 minutes. I'll guide you guys through the rest of the workshop.
Let me know when you'd like to open the rooms.
Yeah, that's going to come a little bit later. Give you guys about another minute or so. Okay, hopefully you guys are able to get through that article. Let's move on to step 1 and the table. So starting with source content, a little bit of blurb of what we're looking for each category. We're describing what you as the peer reviewer are describing what the source is about, any perspectives presented in the source, any biases, and how the claims are written and supported. So in this case, and again, what we wrote on the table, it doesn't necessarily mean it's correct. This is just what our team interpreted from the source. So we noted how anti-gender studies, the author made the source read as, it was Huffington Post. We'll get to that. I'll get to that in a minute. We also noted how there was no significant data to back up the claims that the author was making, and how it was a very narrow perspective through which they viewed the existence of gender studies as a higher education pathway. For source type, we are looking at the genre of the piece or attributes about it, the audience that it's intended for, any writing mechanics utilized, and again, how the claims are conveyed. So in this case, we labeled this as an opinionated piece because, as you can tell, the author was very much against gender studies, and we figured it was very much opinionated to the extent that it could be construed as propaganda, because the attacks made about gender studies as a discipline were not supported sufficiently, and were very politically motivated as well. And for source venue, we're looking at the actual site where the piece was published. Is the site well known? What are its affiliations? And does the source fit with the nature of the venue? And this is where that comment is very interesting, because Huffington Post as a venue is a left/liberal leaning venue. And so we thought it was very interesting that this piece, which is very much against liberal ideas, was featured on this site. And so things like this are important to note when we're analyzing these sources, because students may not necessarily be able to differentiate between whether this source belongs on this website or whether it's out of place. And the fact that it is out of place is something that definitely should be considered in the analysis. Finally, for author expertise, we're looking at what information about the author's life, credentials, or affiliations are available on the website. So on Huffington Post, there is a quick little bio about the author. It describes him as a freelance conservative writer, hence his opinions against gender studies. We also saw how all his articles posted on the Huffington Post are politically charged in the same manner that this one was. But we did not see the area or his blog site, since I think it's been taken down or removed. We also don't know his credentials or education, where he got them from. All right, so that's step one. Again, it's just for you as the peer reviewer to put down what you interpreted from the source. Now we're going to go into what the student actually wrote. So this excerpt is from one of our student essays, albeit a little bit modified. So I'm just going to read it really quickly. The other charge against gender studies is that it is worthless as a degree. One holder of this view is Fox contributor Lucas Michaelionis, who says he worries about, quote, high-achieving women who are being radicalized, victimized, and then deceived in studying subjects like gender studies. Michaelionis, a conservative freelancer, aligns with Tuaniga's belief in gender studies as ideology, but first and foremost, he berates the talentless hacks who felt the need to study gender in the first place. In articles where Michaelionis serves as a reporter, he manages to present the story with little reflection on his own biases. Yet, in opinion pieces such as this one, inflammatory and absolute language are rampant. This extremism justifies disregarding Michaelionis' opinion piece, even though his credentials would otherwise portray him as credible. We aren't exactly sure where the student found the credentials regarding Michaelionis, since they weren't featured on Huffington Post, but they might still be available in some other domains on the internet. So step 2 is the peer review source analysis chart, very similar to step 1, except now we're going to be analyzing how the student interpreted the source, noting strengths and areas for improvement. With source content, we noted that the student was very good in using quotes and citations from the source. They also pointed out the inflammatory and absolute language, meaning they were really digging into the content of this source. An area for improvement that we noted was just noting which topics the author thinks education should be focused on, because in the source, this author was very anti-gender studies, but he also had his own conservative infused opinions on what he thinks higher education should be like. With source type, we're again looking at how the student represented the genre of the source. In the student's writing, they noted the heavy opinions presented by the author. They described attributes that would make it an opinion piece, which is very much what the source was. Suggestions for improvement, and sometimes these can be a little bit nitpicky, but it's good for the peer reviewer to dig down and find an area to improve regardless. So we thought it would be good to organize descriptions of each source in the student's writing into a label or code, like opinionated, book chapter, think piece, reported article. It just makes analysis a little bit easier, in our opinion. With source venue, again, the venue was not mentioned, so they didn't mention that it was cited, or that this piece was featured on the Huffington Post, which is, again, very interesting, with Huffington Post being a left-leaning publication. So that was kind of our area for improvement, pointing out the odd discrepancies between this piece and the venue that it was featured on. Finally, for author expertise, the student did note the conservative orientation of the author as a Fox News contributor, but they did also conclude that the source should be disregarded just because of the opinionated nature of the source, even though the author has certain credentials that would portray them as trustworthy. And so in our opinion, we think just because a source is opinionated or very much like propaganda, it doesn't mean it's inadequate to use in analysis, as long as these aspects of the source are noted. Okay, so that was a run through of our source tool. And again, it's very modifiable, but moving on, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Pfeiffer, and she's going to go through the actual workshop part of this presentation.
Okay, great. So we're going to move into breakout rooms at this point. And I think we've got it set up so that there are going to be like around 4 people in each breakout room, and each one of us will join you in, or one of the presenters will join each of the breakout rooms. And we're going to have you kind of move through the steps that Bryce just demonstrated. You're going to use a different source and a different paragraph of student writing. And those are both on our YRC workshop materials document, which is linked here. But I will also, well, actually, Nicole, could you put a link to that in the chat?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this is just to kind of let you know what you're going to be seeing. The first step, like Bryce said, sort of looks like this. You're going to read the article linked on the document. You're going to use the criteria below to consider the source. And then you're going to move into reviewing the way the student wrote about the source, making comments like Bryce said about strengths and weaknesses of how the student talked about the source. And you know this because you are practitioners, but the idea here is that neither party's interpretation is necessarily correct. We're just sort of looking to generate a multiplicity of perspectives about it to sort of like get conversation going in the peer review process, right? And we have some sample comments over here that if you were presenting this activity to students, you might want to share with them just to give them some language in terms of how to approach their peers' work. I appreciate your analysis. One area of improvement. Description of the source content is well formed. I would like to suggest I interpreted the source's venue as blah, 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 blah. Brenda has a question.
Oh, yes. I just wasn't sure if you wanted us to be able to write directly on the document or not, because we don't have access to writing, just view it. I mean, it's fine either way. I just wanted to clarify.
The idea was that you would make a copy and then each group would share one copy within the group. You can get folks' email addresses so that you can all write on the same document if that works.
Okay.
Okay.
And how long do you want for the breakout rooms? We have about 23 minutes left.
Yeah, let's say 15 minutes.
15? Okay.
Yeah.
And that'll give you enough time for the end and questions?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. And so then you'll fill out this form, which we have down below. Okay, great. So Dan has set up the breakout rooms and we can go along into them and give this a try.
Hello, welcome back, everyone. So I will let the wonderful group finish their presentation, and then we have 7 minutes, so hopefully we have a little time for questions. And
yes, okay, so what we'd love to do is hear a little bit from you folks about your experience trying this out. Okay, so what was it like to use this peer review tool?
I thought it was fun and well organized. The graphic organizer is helpful. I
Okay, the graphic organizer was working. Dominique, were you saying something?
Yeah, as a librarian, I think that this is like incredibly helpful for students. Because in our information literacy sessions, we want them to look at these sources and think critically about them. So having a tool where they're able to go back and forth between the article and, the questions that are being presented, I think that that's going to be so helpful. So thank you for presenting this.
Thanks. Any other general responses? Oh yeah, it would be helpful to see the original prompt given to students. Kimberly wrote in the chat, and yes, we can provide that. Okay, okay. Mara?
I'm curious how you talk about and maybe differentiate between like expertise and bias, because it seems like there's a sort of thin line there that a lived experience can be seen as bias or it can be seen as expertise. And I was just thinking about, maybe different contexts. So for instance, somebody writing about their experience in a protest movement that's related to an aspect of their identity, would that, how do you talk about that in terms of, expertise? And what would you say to a student that maybe thinks about that in terms of bias? Does that make sense?
Yes, such a good question. Do any of my fellow presenters want to chime in response? I just feel like I want to sort of like sit with that.
I can chime in a little bit. I think personally, I think things like the trust indicators and talking about genre and expectations of genre can be really helpful for that. So, the reason, it's appropriate to have, well, first just talking about like editorial perspective versus bias, and, talking about journalistic ethics. So being able to contextualize when people's opinions and perspectives are appropriate or not, given the genre, can be really helpful in teasing that out. Mm-hmm. That's one way that I think about it, but I think there's other ways.
Well, yeah, and the trust indicators too have the local sourcing category, which is a sort of interesting way to think about something like lived expertise, and
diverse voices too.
Yeah, diverse voices, right. So it might factor in that way as well. Thanks for that question. We only have 4 minutes left, I'm realizing, so I don't want to give short shrift to other people's questions, even though I was intending to debrief here. So maybe we should just cut to general Q&A so that we can talk through things, because I'm also seeing that there are questions in the chat or responses in the chat. Yeah, Heather?
Yeah, quick question in terms of student demographics. In terms of economic class, I notice in discussions of students, often class is left as an implied marker. But I'd be curious to know how that cut across your sample, or if it was mentioned, or if it makes a presence at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, another very good question. That was not something that any of the students who we interviewed brought up in their interview. Am I remembering that correctly, Nicole?
You are remembering that correctly.
And it's interesting, there's no like self-reported data on that when students enter the institution, right? So we don't have that to sort of fall back on either. But you're making me think about how that is like a sort of hidden or invisible experience that may have, that probably almost certainly did shape how students responded to some of these sources, and it's hard to track. Yeah.
I would add to that I have, Santa Clara has a particular demographic and tends to be higher socioeconomic. I think it would be fascinating to do a similar study at a different kind of institution, and an institution that has more, economic diversity. Or
yeah, I was thinking about UCSC. I think we have a wide range, how that would play out. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. But I do think it was interesting that it was not limited to race, that the sort of minoritized category that we came up with, it was definitely not just about race. It was other identity characteristics that came up. So
because you took it from the data itself.
yes, exactly. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Thank you, Bryce, for putting the response to the chat question as well. But does anyone else have a final question for our wonderful presenters?
Can I just make one more comment that I don't think
absolutely.
So just to sort of like a piece of our thinking around this tool, it takes so much work to read and time to read the sources that students used. And we know it's not realistic for any faculty member to do that. So I think one of the potential benefits of this is to make it manageable and to have a process that engages students in that review process. So yeah, I can tell you it took us so much time to read all the articles and analyze them. So
yeah, and our idea is that, in a peer review setting, a student would read one source and respond to one paragraph, right? Because like any more than that actually requires too much class time probably, right? But that kind of in-depth analysis of sources is what we feel like is what's useful in terms of like, actually understanding the source and being able to write about it effectively.
And apply those skills to other sources then.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much. This was really, really interesting and helpful. And I know a number of us are already thinking of how we're going to implement both the tool and your findings into our courses.